Lingqi, also known as death by 1,000 cuts, was one of the most excruciating punishments in ancient China. It was reserved for the worst crimes: treason, patricide, or mass murder. The executioner wouldn't simply kill the victim. Instead, he would slice away bits of flesh from the arms, legs, chest, slowly, methodically. The goal wasn't a quick death, but prolonged suffering. In some cases, the victim was kept alive through opium or wine, just to extend the torture. It was as much psychological as it was physical, not just pain, but humiliation in front of crowds. Lingqi wasn't meant to kill instantly. It was meant to erase the person piece by piece. The final blow, often to the heart or neck, was only delivered after the body was reduced to near nothing. Though it's no longer practiced, Lingqi still stands as one of history's most terrifying examples of how cruelty can be ritualized into law. Scaphism. Scaphism was a nightmare born in ancient Persia. The victim was trapped between two hollowed-out wooden boats, one on top, one below, with their head, hands, and feet sticking out. Then came the milk and honey. It was poured down their throat until they vomited and smeared over their exposed skin to attract insects. Left in a swamp or under the sun, the person wasn't killed directly. Instead, flies, worms, and beetles would feast on their flesh. Days passed, sometimes weeks. The victim died slowly, usually from infection, dehydration, or madness. There was no escape, only decay. Scaphism wasn't just torture, it was rotting in real time. Blood eagle. This Norse execution was as symbolic as it was horrifying. Reserved for traitors, the blood eagle involved cutting open the victim's back and slicing through the ribs to pull them outward, like wings. The lungs were then dragged out and draped over the shoulders, giving the appearance of an eagle in flight. Whether the victim was dead by then or still alive is still debated, but Norse records describe it as an offering to Odin. It was more than just execution, it was a warning. The pear of anguish. At first glance it looks like a flower, but it blooms into pain. The pear of anguish was a metal device inserted into the mouth, rectum, or genitals, depending on the crime. Once inside, it could be expanded using a screw mechanism, slowly, painfully. It didn't slice, and it tore. This was often used on heretics, liars, or those accused of perversion. It wasn't designed to kill outright, but the internal damage could be devastating, and the humiliation was often worse than the pain. The brazen bull. The brazen bull was a horrifying execution device used in ancient Greece. It was a hollow bronze statue shaped like a bull, designed to contain a person inside. Once the victim was locked inside, a fire was lit beneath the structure, heating the metal and roasting the person alive. To make the suffering even more grotesque, pipes were installed in the bull's mouth to distort the victim's screams, making them sound like the roar of an angry animal. This transformed the execution into a spectacle for onlookers, masking the agony inside with an artificial sound. Judas cradle. This one came straight from medieval Europe's darkest chambers. The Judas cradle was a pyramid-shaped seat, tall, pointed, and unforgiving. The victim was suspended above it, then slowly lowered onto the sharp tip. The point was inserted into the anus or vagina, and their own body weight did the rest. Movement made it worse. Struggling meant deeper wounds, and sometimes they were kept like that for hours, even days. Infection, internal damage, and psychological trauma followed. It wasn't just torture, it caused severe physical and psychological harm. Flaying alive. Flaying alive was a brutal form of execution, used by various ancient civilizations. It involved removing the victim's skin while they were still alive, starting at the limbs and moving inward. The process was carried out using knives, hooks, or sharpened stones. Most victims did not survive long, as shock, blood loss, and unbearable pain quickly led to death. Their flayed skin was then displayed publicly to intimidate others. It was a method of punishment designed to instill fear. Iron Maiden. The Iron Maiden was a supposed medieval torture device shaped like a human-sized coffin and lined with metal spikes on the inside. When closed, the spikes pierced the victim at non-lethal points, causing severe pain and slow death through suffocation, bleeding, or shock. Some historians debate whether it was ever truly used, but its legend remains a powerful symbol of medieval brutality. The breaking wheel. The breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel, was a brutal execution method designed to crush bones systematically. The victim was tied to a large wooden wheel, while the executioner used an iron bar to break their limbs one by one. If death did not come quickly, the wheel was raised on a post, leaving the broken body exposed until nature took its course. In some cases, the executioner delivered a final blow to the chest for a quicker death, but this was not always granted. Keel hauling. Used by pirates and navies alike, keel hauling was a punishment designed for both pain and fear. The victim was tied with ropes and dragged underneath the ship, from one side to the other, scraping against sharp barnacles, splinters, and jagged wood. If the wounds didn't kill them, drowning usually did, and if they somehow survived, they were often left disfigured, bleeding, and barely alive. It was a sailor's worst nightmare, punishment hidden beneath the waves, sawing in half. There was no quick end with this one. The victim was hung upside down, legs spread, head closest to the ground. Then the saw was placed between the thighs and pulled downward. Gravity kept the blood flowing to the brain, so the person stayed conscious for far longer than they should. The sawing continued through the pelvis, abdomen, sometimes even to the chest, before death finally came. It wasn't just torture, it was a slow-motion execution. The rack. The rack didn't hide its intentions. The victim was laid flat on a wooden frame, wrists and ankles tied to rollers on either end. Then, slowly, the wheels were turned. Limbs stretched. Joints popped. Tendons snapped, bones dislocated. It could turn a healthy body into a shattered ruin in minutes. It wasn't always used to kill, and sometimes it was just to get a confession. But what came out was often less truth and more survival. Rat torture. Rats fear fire, and that fear was turned into pain. The victim was tied down, and a metal container filled with rats was placed on their chest or stomach. Then heat was applied to the other side, usually fire. Trapped and desperate to escape, the rats would burrow downward into the softest flesh they could find. Claws, teeth, panic. The rats dug through skin, muscle, even organs. This was no accident. It was a deliberate invitation for chaos to eat someone alive, from the inside out. Garrote execution. The garrote was quiet, but final. Used in Spain and across parts of Europe, it looked simple. A wooden chair with a metal collar fixed to the back. The victim sat down and the iron collar was locked tight around the neck. Then came the screw. Turned slowly, deliberately. It crushed the windpipe or snapped the spine. Some versions had a sharp spike that pierced the skull as it turned. There was no blood, no spectacle, just the sound of bone giving way. Death came silently, publicly. It was often reserved for traitors, heretics, or political enemies. And once that collar turned, there was no coming back. Cropping. This one didn't aim to kill, just to mark forever. Cropping involved slicing off the victim's ears, usually for crimes like slander or theft. Sometimes the ears were nailed to a pillory before being cut off. The pain was sharp, but the message was sharper. You'd wear your shame for life. And often, the crowds weren't kind either. Spanish tickler. Despite its misleading name, this was a tool of pure brutality. Made of iron claws, the Spanish tickler was designed to rip flesh from bone rather than simply cut. Victims' arms, legs, and torso were scraped with the jagged metal, peeling away skin and exposing nerves, causing unimaginable pain. Unlike a clean blade, this device shredded the body messily, ensuring wounds were deep and impossible to heal properly. To intensify the suffering, executioners sometimes heated it first, making sure every stroke left scorched, raw tissue in its wake. Survival was possible, but those who lived bore scars that marked them forever, a testament to their torment. The heretic's fork. This device wasn't meant to kill, but to force obedience through silence and stillness. A short metal rod with spikes at both ends, it was placed between the victim's chin and chest. Any movement, nodding, speaking, even slumping, would drive the spikes deeper, making even the slightest motion unbearable. It was a psychological punishment as much as a physical one. Victims were kept upright for days, unable to rest or shift, their bodies trembling under the pressure. The worst part? It wasn't a dramatic torture filled with screaming, it was quiet, agonizing restraint, where survival depended entirely on enduring complete stillness. Neck violin, Schongeige. Used in medieval Germany, this wooden frame locked both the neck and wrists, forcing the victim into an awkward, rigid position. It wasn't meant to kill, only to humiliate. Gossipers, argumentative neighbors, or troublemakers were paraded through town, mocked by crowds. In some cases, two people were locked together until they resolved their dispute. Iron chair? This was not a chair meant for rest. It was an instrument of agony. Covered in hundreds of metal spikes, it left no part of the body untouched. Victims were strapped in tightly, ensuring that even the slightest movement drove the spikes deeper into their flesh. In some cases, heat was applied from below, prolonging the suffering and turning pain into slow torture. Death came gradually, minute by minute. Thumb screws. At first glance, thumb screws seemed like an unimposing contraption, just a simple pair of metal plates with a screw mechanism. But once fingers, toes, or even ears were placed between the plates, a slow, agonizing process would begin. With each turn of the screw, pressure increased until nails fractured, bone splintered, and flesh tore apart. The pain was unbearable, but what made this device particularly cruel was its ability to prolong agony without immediate fatal consequences. Victims were often subjected to hours of torment, their broken fingers left mangled beyond recognition. And because thumb screws caused permanent damage, those who survived would carry their twisted, useless hands as a lifelong testament to their suffering. Used as a favored tool for interrogation, it ensured confessions, truthful or otherwise, would come simply for the sake of relief. Coffin torture. Imagine being locked inside a metal cage, barely large enough to contain your body. There's no way to sit comfortably, no room to adjust, and your limbs begin to cramp within minutes. The design ensured that the prisoner remained trapped in a standing position, an agony in itself. Days passed and starvation gnawed away at their strength, while the crowd treated the captive as a spectacle of suffering. In colder climates, the frigid air would bite into exposed flesh. In scorching heat, dehydration would set in. Some were left to rot in their own filth, their bodies becoming too weak to hold up their heads. Wild animals occasionally prowled, sniffing at the helpless prisoner, testing whether they were fresh enough to devour. Whether one lived or died, the torment remained the same, bound in an unforgiving cage with no control over their fate. The lead sprinkler. At first, the device appeared unassuming, a hollow ball with small holes attached to a long handle. But instead of dispensing harmless powder or spices, this sinister tool was used to pour molten metal directly onto a victim's flesh. The heat was instantaneous, searing through skin and muscle in mere seconds. If applied to the eyes, blindness was guaranteed. If poured onto the stomach, it could penetrate deep into organs, ensuring an agonizing death. During the Inquisition, the lead sprinkler was often presented as an instrument of purification. The metal baptized victims in a brutal, irreversible manner, leaving their bodies disfigured beyond recognition. It was a slow, methodical execution, the kind that made witnesses shudder knowing that the pain was dragged out deliberately for maximum effect. Boiling alive. One of the most visceral and terrifying punishments in history. The victim was forced into a cauldron filled with water, oil, or molten lead. Sometimes they were dropped in suddenly, their body thrashing as they tried to escape the consuming heat. But in the cruelest cases, the liquid was heated slowly, forcing them to endure every stage stage of suffering. First, the skin reddened. Then, blisters bubbled up, bursting open to expose raw flesh. Muscles contracted uncontrollably, locked in agony as tendons stiffened under the rising temperature. The victims screamed, but the steam suffocated their voice, making their cries sound distant and hollow. By the time death finally arrived, they were no longer recognizable. Just a charred, boiled husk of what once had been a living person. Cement shoes. A perfect execution method for those who wanted to ensure a body would never be found. Victims were forced to step into buckets filled with wet cement, their feet encased as the mixture hardened. The drying process was slow, giving them ample time to panic, beg, or plead. Once solidified, they were taken to a secluded area, often a bridge or an abandoned dock, and simply thrown into the water. There was no struggle, no splashing. The weight pulled them down instantly, sinking them deep into the abyss below. The silence was eerie, broken only by the soft ripples as the surface smoothed over. No evidence remained, no blood, no visible wounds, just an unsettling emptiness where a person had once stood.